Welcome to this week's edition of Good Books Radio. Audiobooks.com is the chief underwriter for Good Books Radio, which is produced by UTRGV Media Services for Rio Grande Valley Public Radio. And now, here's your host, Dr. W.F. Strong.
Welcome to Good Books Radio, ladies and gentlemen. I'm your host, Dr. W.F. Strong, and we want to make sure to thank our underwriter, audiobooks.com, where your first book is free. Just log into audiobooks.com, and for about $14 a month, you can listen to a premium work each month, and sometimes 2 or 3 books if you take advantage of their frequent special deals. Audiobooks.com, check them out. You know, a few times in your life, you come across an author who makes you realize immediately that you're in the presence of a storyteller of rare genius. For me, Gabriel Garcia Marquez was such a writer, so was Twain, so was Dickens, and now I'm happy to say that I've come across another writer who has had a similar effect on me. It's too early, naturally, to put him in that pantheon of, shall we say, literary elites, but he could be on his way. He could be. He just needs another 5 or 6 novels as good as the 2 he's already written, and maybe he'll get there. His name is Amor Towles. He's with us today to talk about his exquisite new novel, A Gentleman in Moscow. Now, before we begin our conversation with him, I have to tell you that the praise for this book is impressive. Amazon reviewers, they give it 5 stars. Amazon selected it as the September book of the month. Goodreads gives it 4.5 stars. And all the major literary reviewers cannot seem to praise it enough. The New York Times, I just learned, has rated it as number 8 on their most important list, I would say. And the praise for this book, as I said, is impressive. Kirkus Reviews says, spread across 4 decades, this is in all ways a great novel, a nonstop pleasure, brimming with charm, personal wisdom, and philosophic insight. Oprah Magazine says it is elegant as a lavishly filigreed Fabergé egg. I wonder how long they had to stay up to think of that. And Cindy Burnett, who is just an Amazon reviewer, just a regular person like you and I, she said, if you do not read another book this year, read A Gentleman in Moscow. I agree with Cindy. Amor, welcome to the show.
Bill, thanks very much for having me. After that introduction, I should excuse myself because it can only go down. I'm only going to make it worse from here.
Well, I think this praise is much deserved. Certainly from my point of view, because this novel is what you want of a novel. I mean, I told my wife, I said, it's kind of like, watching a great black and white film on a Saturday afternoon. It's romantic and beautiful and charming, and you don't come across these very often. So I'm grateful to you for giving me this wonderful experience. I'm somewhat in the mind of that guy who told Mark Twain that he would give anything in the world if he hadn't read Huckleberry Finn, so he could again have the joy of reading it for the first time.
Yeah, you're very nice. Thank you.
Well, let's talk about how this came to be. You're American, and yet you've written this Russian novel that makes me think of Tolstoy. So how did this happen?
Yeah, well, and I guess I'll say sort of quickly that the odd premise of the book is that it opens at a tribunal in the Kremlin in 1922, where a 30-year-old aristocrat is being interviewed. And in the course of this quick interview, it becomes clear that the Count who wrote a poem that was popular with the revolutionary generation, that he has some friends high up in the party, but he's clearly an unrepentant aristocrat. And the tribunal views him as sort of a danger to society as a result. So almost as a compromise, they say he can go back to the Metropol hotel where he's been staying, and if he ever comes out of the hotel again, he's going to be shot. Mm-hmm. And, with the bang of the gavel, he's marched out of the Kremlin, across Red Square, into this historic hotel, and that's really where the novel begins and where the Count stays for the next 30-plus years, and it's where I ask you, as the reader, to stay for the next 30-plus years. And I know that's not necessarily a very enticing invitation, so it's my job to make that a rich and entertaining experience for you. But, why Russia? I'm a great fan of Russian literature. a fan of Russian history, of Russian culture. And when I years ago came up with sort of this crazy notion of writing a novel in which a man was trapped in a hotel, Russia just seemed like the perfect place to do it.
I think so. And you bring the whole world inside that hotel.
Yeah, well, thanks. I think that is the nature of the challenge as an author. By really committing myself to tracking the life of my main character within the walls of the hotel almost entirely, I do have to ultimately reach out and bring the world in. In retrospect, I think I'm not going to compare myself to Melville, Herman Melville, who's a great hero of mine, but Moby Dick, in a way, it's got the same problem. At the beginning of Moby Dick, you and Ishmael get on the Pequod with Captain Ahab, and you're stuck on the boat for the remainder of the book, with a small group of men out at sea, and Melville has to bring the world to you, and he does so in these very inventive ways. I obviously have the advantage that in a hotel, the world can come and go through the hotel, even as the Count cannot. And so he gets to see the movement of history outside the doors. He gets to interact with both the professionals in the hotel, the guests in the hotel, strangers, and he can find a richness in his life despite his confinement.
Well, I have to tell you that one of the reasons I particularly related to this is I worked my way through college and graduate school working in hotels. And,
okay.
And I wasn't.
Well, then you're...
I wasn't in one of these elegant hotels like the Metropol, but I was in, kind of your average mid-sized city hotel, but the same rhythms apply. You'd have the same people staying, coming and going. You would have the whole world pass through eventually. And I used to say it was like traveling by standing still.
Yeah, I think I think that being in a hotel is a relatively universal experience. And the Metropol, which really does exist, was opened in 1905, before the Revolution, and was really the largest and most luxurious hotel in the country at the time. And it was really, as a grand hotel, not that different from the Plaza in New York, or the Waldorf Astoria in New York, or the Ritz in Paris, or the Palace in San Francisco, which were all built around the same time, these grand hotels. So I think the interesting thing is, for Americans who don't know a lot about Russia, they will recognize in the life of the hotel, kind of just as you say, because the lobby in a grand hotel is universal. You can go to any hotel on a grand scale anywhere in Europe, anywhere in the United States, and the lobby has that same sort of feel of the palm court and people drinking and reading newspapers and strangers coming and going. That's just a universal factor.
One of the things I love that you did early on is, you moved him from his grand suite to this 100-square-foot space of a closet that they put him in. And I wondered, as you did that, did you ever mark out 100 square feet and try to stay in that a while yourself?
Yeah, I did think about that a little bit. I work in a small little sort of library / office in my home in New York. And I did kind of pace out that room, which I spent a lot of time in, thinking, how big was his room? Is it this size? Is it half this size? Is it a third of this size? And yes, I ended up putting him in a room about the third of the size of my office, and did think about that. And I actually, I paced it. I kind of thought, if there's a bed here and a bureau there, how much room have you got left to walk around? Because he does kind of go through a series of humblings. Not only is he getting under house arrest, but as you say, they put him in the small room, and he goes through this sort of series of humblings, and that's kind of the wall he's got to climb back up, as it were, in sort of a finding connection to people, a sense of purpose, despite the fact that the Bolsheviks have taken away his family, his possessions, and his way of life.
Yeah, that was really cruel of you, because after the tribunal sentenced him to life in the hotel, essentially, I thought, well, not the worst thing that could happen. He has a beautiful suite. And then he goes back, and they immediately say, no. Get what you can, and we're taking you up to the belfry. Oh, man.
Right.
That was brutal. Now, did you think of that idea early on? I'm going to move him from this situation to this situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think I guess I should say, start first of all, that the premise for the whole book came out of I spent a lot of time in hotels as an investment professional. I wrote fiction as a kid. I wrote it in high school and college, but I was an investment professional for 20 years, and I would visit hotels for my firm for extended stays, around the United States, in Europe. Uh-huh. And in one of those hotels, arriving for the 8th year in a row, I recognized people from the previous year. And I thought, this is a pretty nice hotel, but can you imagine if you had to live here?
Yeah, that's true. And
that kind of started the process, and I outlined in great detail. So having had that notion in 2009, I didn't start writing the book until 4 years later. And over the course of that 4 years, on and off, I was writing and outlining greater and greater and greater detail, making many of the decisions like the one you just asked about where does he live and what does it look like, who does he meet, what are the events that happen. Because when I start writing the first page, I really want to have a very keen sense of the settings, the people, the themes, and all of the events in hand. But I think probably one of the reasons that I put him up in the attic. I mean, there were multiple reasons, but one is that wasn't that uncommon for the nobility and the aristocracy who stayed in Russia. Mm-hmm. Certainly, a significant portion of the aristocracy left Russia after the revolution. Some were killed or imprisoned. That's true as well. But a significant portion of the aristocracy stayed in the country, and they were often allowed to actually stay in their ancestral homes, these mansions, but they were given one room instead of 30 to move into. And then they would move in, 30 other families. So, that is some sort of historical truth to that. They were in the hotel, but they were in their own mansion, sort of in the smallest room on the top floor, sharing their ancestral home with 20 other families.
Well, one of the points that you make, and you do this really well throughout the book, these little philosophical asides, I would call them. And one of the points you make I'd like to elaborate on is this notion that, the people's revolutions that occur around the world are often about egalitarianism and absolute equality for everybody. Nobody's better than anybody else. And yet, it doesn't take long for the natural human respect for hierarchy to begin rearing its ugly head, if we call it that. And so explain that. You had a particularly good paragraph on that.
You're right. That is, certainly the book, sort of looks at that because, and historically speaking, and again, this, as you say, this is a novel. It's not a work of history, but the background is that only 10% of Russians, roughly, were members of the Communist Party during the 20s, 30s, and 40s in Russia. And that's not because the other 90% didn't want to be communists. It's because they weren't. Because quite quickly, even though being a member of the party initially was sort of a mark of ideological purity, and it quickly became a gateway to privilege. Mm-hmm. If you were a member of the party, you had access to better apartment buildings, better stores with more food in them. Mm-hmm. Your kids got to go to better schools. So even though, as you say, it was a proletarian revolution with the goal of making all things equal for everybody, quite naturally in human nature, the people in charge kind of quickly became an upper class. So they had flipped the class upside down. The mm-hmm. nobles were suddenly penniless and demeaned, mm-hmm. and those who had been in the working class in some cases were suddenly like royalty in mm-hmm. the new era. Yeah,
I like the line. I can't remember it exactly, but you said that after a while, the people who were important would begin to say, well, someone of my importance ought to have a bigger chair.
That's right. Yeah, it doesn't take long. I think in that section, it's almost I say that pomp is almost like a force out there, a living spirit, and pomp will go and find the winners of the revolution, and the pomp doesn't care whether it's with the king or the new guy. That it'll find the new king.
Well, another part of the book that I really love is just a couple of pages, but I think anybody who's worked in bureaucracy, will love that particular part where you talk about how the committee of the railroad union meets to look at their charter and they spend, hours discussing one word and whether that one word is appropriate. That particular part of the book, I read it out loud to my wife, and then she read it herself because she had just been through some long committee meetings of various types, and she just loved it because it was so perfect.
Yeah, anybody who sat on a committee, as you say, we've all, wrestled over the 3 sentences in a charter statement, and it's amazing how much time you can spend on it. And there's something sort of ridiculous about that, and there's something grand about that, and you kind of have in that scene both viewpoints. The Count sort of makes fun of all the effort that they're spending on this, choosing the word, but he's in the company of a 9-year-old girl who kind of is the daughter of a Bolshevik executive and is very precocious.
I love her.
And she sees it very differently. She sort of finds the whole thing very exciting. And the Count sort of has to admit, maybe there is something exciting about this too. But yes, there's kind of always the two sides of the coin, as it were.
Tell me about Nina. She is delightful. Yeah,
Nina is a 9-year-old girl who's living in the hotel when the Count first is put under house arrest, and she's a key figure for him early in the book, because on the one hand he's a very optimistic person, genetically, as it were. He is a person who's been raised to never show defeat to an opponent, and this helps him face his confinement. But nonetheless, he's feeling some malaise, a little depressed, and his first lucky break is he meets this 9-year-old girl, who is the daughter of a Bolshevik, but in a 9-year-old girl way, she's fascinated by the fact that he was a count. And, she wants to know all about the princesses he knew and whether he'd been to dances and balls. And most importantly, she does not look at the hotel, even though she spends all her time there. She doesn't look at it as a confined space. She sees it as sort of an infinite, rich, exciting place to explore. And she kind of gives him that insight that, that the hotel, if you approach it the right way, can fill you with, a sense of adventure. And that opens a doorway for him into rethinking it. And the book spans 30 years, and so you do get to see her come of age too, become more serious as a teenager and in her early 20s, and she leaves the hotel, and you kind of learn what her life goes, how it changes. And each of these kind of relationships, they become the new family for the Count, having lost the family he was raised with.
Tell us about the rooms that she takes him to see, because that's a beautiful part of the book where he realizes that he has only seen, 3/4 of the hotel, and there's this whole magical backstory.
Yes, he sees her sort of zipping by one morning while he's feeling sort of bored and depressed, and he's sort of, where are you headed? And she kind of, after a moment, sort of secretly, quietly admits where she's going, and it turns out that she has become an aficionado of the hidden corners of the hotel. She takes him to the basement where the furnace is. And as she says, it's a perfect place to destroy illicit love letters. She takes him to the electrical room in the basement where you can with a single switch turn out all the lights in the ballroom. Which was perfect if you want to steal jewels. And so she takes him to all these little spots, and as I say, kind of opening up his eyes to just sort of the youthful sense of excitement that you can have. The way I like to think of it is, I don't think claustrophobia is a malady experienced by children. That's a grown-up problem. Children, they don't mind being in a small space, so because they have such rich imaginations. But the way that the Count realizes it in his sort of walking with Nina is it's like being in the first class of an ocean liner. Where you kind of think you could have lived a very rich day and had full use of the boat because you gambled and sat at the captain's table and danced with someone you've met, but all the while you've only seen 20% of the boat. There's the engine room and the quarters where the staff sleep and the navigation rooms, and there's all these other aspects to the boat that keep it moving. You just never even think about, and kind of, again, part of his awareness. Nina has treated the hotel not as kind of in this just on the surface. She's been looking at the entire building from basement to attic.
Yes, and the other thing that she does for him, and rather quickly, is because she gives him this tour and teaches him to think about doors behind doors and walls behind walls, that she quite literally is responsible for opening up his world.
Yes, that's right. He discovers, in essence, an unused room, partly by her encouragement, and that radically changes his experience in the hotel, and because it becomes a secret space for him. And as he observes, if you take two rooms of the same size, and one is the one you're required to stay in, and the other is the one that you found and kind of it's secret to you, your experience of those spaces is very different. You know, the one that you have to sit in feels very small. The one that you've gone and found in a secret can feel as big as your imagination allow it to be.
And I love those points that you make rather consistently through it. This kind of philosophy of the human spirit, you might say. And there are paragraphs that make you stop and say, I must read that again. There's something magical there. And that's what makes the book special, is over and over again you want to stop and reread a paragraph.
Thank you, Bill.
I think
I was going to say that I like the way you put that, and I do think sort of an aspect of the book, an important one, is an invitation partly to Americans to some degree to broaden their view of Russia during these decades. We were all raised to recognize Russia in the 20s and 30s and 40s as an era of shortages, including some famine years, of purges and fear of arrest, of political and artistic oppression. And these are absolutely aspects to Russian life during that time. But we have to keep in mind that the vast majority of Russians continue to fall in love, to get married, to have children, to celebrate holidays with their family members, and fashion memories and attachments, and to have dreams, listen to music, appreciate art. So life is certainly, even in a time of pressure like that, it can be very rich, and I think there is sort of a certain will to joy in the human species, and so part of the story is taking this individual who's in this greater context of a challenged era and seeing how the individual finds opportunities for joy given his constraints.
Oh, I was so impressed with the Count's magnificent elegance that he maintains. It reminded me a little bit of. I forget the who wrote it, but I remember reading a short story a long time ago about a man in Africa, part of the British Empire, who was an administrator in a distant part of Africa, and he would receive the London Times, but he would receive it in 30 papers at a time.
Oh, right.
And he would never open up all 30, no matter how much he wanted to know what happened the next day. He did them one at a time because he wanted to maintain his schedule of civility. Yes, right. Well, let me
go ahead.
Let me go to one other thing, is that we're quick running out of time, unfortunately.
Yes.
Just a kind of general question about writers of modern time is. I was thinking the other day that, like you have a background, you have a master's degree in literature, but specifically in creative writing, right?
No, it's a master's in English.
A master's in English.
It is, yeah, in English. So I studied literature both as an undergraduate and in graduate school. I wrote fiction during college and graduate school, but my degree was in the study of literature rather than the writing of it.
Okay. But you did a lot of writing. I mean, your master's thesis were short stories, really, right?
Well, that's true, yes.
Published in the Paris Review.
That's right.
So that must have been a happy day.
Yes, it was. Right.
So my question is this, that a lot of our top modern writers went to college, went to sometimes writing programs like the Iowa Writing Program. Sometimes they have literature degrees. But the writers of 100 years ago didn't do any of that. They were travelers. They, your Twains, etc., Jack London, and although they were travelers. So how do we make this shift?
I don't. Yeah, it's a good question. I don't. I do personally. Personally, I think that the most valuable thing that I've had for my own writing has been reading. It hasn't been workshops or writing instructors, which are all fine. They serve their purpose, for many writers or young writers. But I think that at the end of the day, reading carefully, and as you say, experiencing life outside of the academy, and thinking about the people you meet, thinking about the places you go to, writing down your own impressions of those things and fine-tuning those impressions, that's really where you build your craft. I suppose that I think the single best thing that a writing class can do for a young writer is it's a deadline. It forces you to finish a story and hand it in, And for young people, that can be very valuable in itself. Whatever guidance you get or instruction, whatever feedback, just the fact that you finally sat down and finished the story is a step in the right direction. And I do think that a lot of young writers, that is an important and principal attraction to a program.
Who do you like? Who do you read?
Well, you mentioned, certainly one of my favorites earlier. I think probably my three favorite novels are 100 Years of Solitude.
Oh yes.
War and Peace, and Moby Dick, and because all three are so sweeping, so humane, and they're humorous, they're exciting, they're thought provoking, and they're poetically written. They're very hard, books to beat.
Oh, that's the understatement of the year right there.
Yeah, right.
And then of course you make the Count, back to your book, A Gentleman in Moscow. You make the Count a reader as well.
Yes, and he's in the 19th century. He was born in 1890, raised as an aristocrat, and so yes, his passion is for the sort of the grand novels of the 19th century. That's right.
And I like that you work in, the fact that he's read Anna Karenina and he rereads books, because made me think of Oscar Wilde, who said that a book isn't worth reading the first time if it isn't worth rereading.
That's right, and I agree with that sentiment entirely. And he's also accounts a little bit of a sentimental figure, so you get the sense that he doesn't always read as a scholar. He's reading it because he's moved by the story and enjoys the flight of fancy, and so yeah, he's erudite in a way, but he's also just sort of a lover of life.
Now, is it true that you spent 7 years writing a book and threw it away?
I did spend 7 years writing a novel that I did not like in the end. I didn't throw it away. It is in a drawer, but you can have it. You can have it if you want it. But that's I guess that's part of the training ground, right? Is I had written many short stories as a younger person. I set out to write my first novel, spent 7 years doing it, and it was not a success in my own eyes. But I certainly learned a great deal from that process.
What do you think keeps people, because you hear it all the time, people say, oh, I've got a novel in me. What is it that keeps people from writing that novel that's in them?
Well, I think most people, what they mean is that they've had interesting experiences, or they've had fun things that happen to them. Every human being could say that, in essence. But to actually have the desire to sit down and write something is a very different impulse and a more rare one. And because it takes a lot of work. It takes you have to be willing to isolate yourself. There's a great deal of drudgery in good writing, because you have to edit the same paragraph 100 times, and be willing to show up and do it again. So at the end of the day, I think everybody has a richness of experience, but I think that fewer people than people imagine have the real desire to actually sit down and translate their impressions into a narrative.
I think you're right. I've talked to a lot of writers, of course, and I often get this same little phrase repeated in one form or another. To be a writer, you must put your butt in the seat.
Yeah, right. That's exactly right. Yeah.
And I was very impressed with an interview I read with Larry McMurtry recently. He's 80 years old now, and he said he still writes 15 pages a day, every day, holidays, doesn't matter. It's his routine.
Yep.
And so
Yep, that's right.
It takes an incredible sort of discipline. But I hope that you will stay disciplined because you have a lot of magic to share with us yet. So I'm excited to see what you produce in the future.
It's certainly my intention to bring you another book or more books. It's going to take me a little while.
And my intention to interview you again. So thank you so much for joining us. We've been talking to Amor Towles about his new book, number 8 on the New York Times bestseller list, A Gentleman in Moscow. For Good Books Radio, I'm Dr. W.F. Strong signing off. Here's hoping that all your books are good reads.